Welcome back to Ideagen TV. We're so excited today to have with us an incredible panel led by the moderator, BJ Moore, Executive Vice President and CIO at Providence St. Joseph Health. BJ, welcome.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and do our power panel today. Just quickly wanted to give you some background on Providence before I introduce the other panelists. So Providence is one of the largest health systems here in the United States. We're basically here on the West Coast in 7 states, 51 hospitals, over 1,000 clinics. We're $25 billion in revenue, 165-year-old company formed by women, something we're very proud of, over 120,000 employees. So big and have some big breadth and impact here in the U.S. and healthcare. Our other claim to fame here with COVID is we actually had the first COVID patient here in the United States. So I have a very unique perspective on that. And today I'm joined by 3 of my colleagues. I'm going to go ahead and allow them to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the panel. So Amy, maybe start with you.
Sure. I'm Dr. Amy Compton-Phillips. I'm an internist and the Chief Clinical Officer here at Providence. Been an internist since 1990, so came of age in the last, when HIV and AIDS was the biggest pandemic around. And we just got these newfangled things in our offices, these desktop computers. And so have been following the trajectory of not only infectious disease and pandemics, but also the advent of computers, automation, AI, and digital technologies over the past several decades.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Michael?
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Larson, CEO of QuiviQ, which is a subsidiary of Providence. We build predictive analytics tools for hospital operations. The team at QuiviQ, myself included, are data scientists. We come from a variety of backgrounds, folks who've been in transportation, manufacturing, technology. Myself, I come from retail, spent a number of years at Amazon. I'm excited to be part of the panel.
Great, thank you. And Ari.
Hey folks, Ari Robicsek. I'm the Chief Medical Analytics Officer here at Providence. I am an infectious disease doctor and hospital epidemiologist by background, and fell into the world of data while I was chasing antibiotic-resistant organisms in populations in Chicago. And I'm lucky to head up a group that thinks about ways that we can use data at Providence to help improve the way we provide care.
Great. Thank you, Ari. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Amy, I'll start with you. Have all of the panelists answer this question. So I mentioned in the introduction, we're at the epicenter, the beginning of the COVID crisis here. What has that experience been like, Amy?
Well, that's a really big question, BJ. What has that experience been like? Like, what's your life been like? So it was a transformative experience, to be honest with you. So we got our first patient, as you mentioned, in the US at the end of January, and we recognized right off, we'd been watching this in the periphery in China, and we knew that there was real risk of a pandemic happening with a respiratory spread novel pathogen. And so knowing that, the day we got the first patient in, we activated the response we'd built in preparation for Ebola, right? We'd been building things in the background. What happens just in case? And so we turned that all on. We put infrastructure in place to make sure that any patient who came in with cough, fever, shortness of breath was identified for any risk for COVID, for example. And we did that across all 20,000 physicians that exist in our system. And we made sure that we had the tools and capabilities available. We also, working with Dr. Robicsek, built a data infrastructure so that we could understand what we were seeing and learn from it very rapidly. We started having huddles so that we could surface information that happened somewhere and get it across all 7 states and across 1,000 medical offices and 51 hospitals. And so we really set up a very robust learning system rapidly so we could figure out what on earth to do with this otherwise unknown germ.
Yeah, and Amy, I want to call out, you had set up the early morning huddles. So all of the executives here at Providence St. Joseph Health every morning at 7:30 would get together. Amy drove that, make sure we're all on the same page, understood where the challenges were, where we needed to accelerate, where we maybe could decelerate. So your leadership has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Amy. Ari, I'm actually going to jump to you because I know you were kind of the data analytics behind all of that. What was your experience like?
It was an interesting and terrifying time. It's not that often in your career when you encounter a situation where you know so little about what you're dealing with and where the need for information is so incredibly great. So as Amy said, a lot of what my team working together with your team was doing was figuring out how do we pull all the data in one place. And part of what was challenging about it was we had new questions every day. Initially we were trying to answer the question, do we have COVID in the United States? Then we were trying to answer questions like, do we have personal protective equipment to handle the number of patients that we have? And then we were immediately asking ourselves the question, well, how many patients are we going to have? And all of these were questions that were different than the sort of questions that we're used to answering. There still are so many unanswered questions about this virus. What's the best way to treat it? How long do symptoms last? What's the safest way to reopen? How dangerous is it for care providers when they're looking after COVID patients? And on and on. And so I don't think I've ever been at a point in my career of chasing down information when it's been so essential to have a good infrastructure for rapidly answering questions as they arise. So it's been a very exciting and challenging and rewarding time.
Yeah. And what I liked is that data allowed us to be data driven. Like you said early on, what were the challenges? Did we have the protective equipment? Did we have the beds? Did we have the ventilators? But you also in parallel did the modeling, right? And projection. And I know in the beginning, those projections were pretty, right? The models hadn't been
Scary.
tested. How do you feel about those predictive models now? I know that we met this morning and the predictive models feel like they're doing pretty well. What's your assessment of those predictive models?
Well, they've gotten a heck of a lot more sophisticated, and I would say that one of the great leaps forward was actually having QuiviQ, so Mike Larson's team, become involved in the modeling process. And I'll just say that we evolved from kind of small homegrown models run off of my desktop to an approach where we started thinking about both more sophisticated modeling methods, but also starting to think in a more sophisticated way about what are the data sources that we could bring to bear. And what I showed this morning was actually the output of 4 different models that competed with each other and can all be used in our decision-making process. And we're actually in the process of building even more models. But I don't know, Michael, maybe you're best to talk about this. Your team is doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
No, I echo Amy and Ari's comments. So one thing I would add is, there's a wealth of literature out there that has dealt with epidemiological modeling for many, many years. One of the real challenges is thinking about not only are these models directly applicable to the scenarios we're seeing, but how does it impact Providence specifically? And I think when we talk more generally about modeling, one of the real challenges is, it's one thing to build a model or a solution for an average hospital, but to start to think about how you build solutions that are going to be robust and extendable across a breadth of systems is a real challenge, especially when things on the ground are changing, when data is in many cases hard to come by, but you start to learn more about these situations, and to Ari's point, you start to think about other data sources that might be indicative and provide valuable clues into finding productive solutions. So it's really been a collaborative effort. I mean, I think you can talk about the data science, but it really is bringing together the folks who are the clinicians, the folks who have expertise with the operational side, the managers on the ground. It's really a team effort.
And it's worth just throwing out to give the audience a sense of the span of different data types that are in the process of being actively used or going into the predictions that the QuiviQ team is making. It started out with basically just our internal data. So how many patients are in house today, because that's what we're ultimately trying to predict for a few weeks in advance. But then we started looking at things like, can we look at our test data? So testing on symptomatic patients in a particular geographical region, testing on asymptomatic patients in that same region. How busy are emergency departments? What's happening in terms of syndromic surveillance? So in the community that's the catchment of a particular hospital, what symptoms are people complaining to their clinicians about? And then we started realizing there's a lot of what we're calling exogenous data as well. Google and Facebook and various other groups that collect cell phone movement data have all made data freely available that can be used for prediction purposes. So we're evaluating all of those right now.
Which is exactly right. But I think one of the things that was really, really interesting about February and March is these guys are talking about using the data to make predictions. We had no data, we had no predictions, and we were going, this is what we think we have to do based on what happened in 1918. We were literally looking back for data that happened 100 years ago to predict what might happen today. And so in a field that has done a lot over the past 20, 30 years to become very much data evidence driven, it was uncomfortable for a lot of us saying, we're going to have to use judgment here because the data simply doesn't exist. And so it was an odd juxtaposition moment in a world that's getting ever more data driven. We had to use logic to make some assumptions.
What I appreciate in those early days is we had focus as an executive team, not having the data. What I've seen, the trap that tech companies fall into is they try to chase 1,000 ideas at once. And I really appreciated that we were focused on the vital few, trying to answer those immediate questions. Did we have enough beds? Did we have enough ventilators? Those things, instead of, trying to boil the ocean. Certainly we've gotten more complex since then, but the focus that you provided, Amy, up front was fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Next question is really around the acceleration and adoption of technology. The statistics I've been throwing out is, over an 8-week period, we did at least 8 months of work. I would say even 2 or 3 years worth of work. The acceleration that we saw in the adoption of tools and technology and things that we did that would have taken months or years was unprecedented. Love to hear from you on how you feel like that technology really changed the way we approached this crisis. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you. Put you on the spot.
Excellent. Appreciate it. I think Amy made a good point just a few minutes ago about the fact that, especially early on, we had to rely so much on judgment. But part of what's happened since then is as you learn more, it's a very adaptive process. So it's an extremely iterative process. And so as more data becomes available, as you have more information, these models are really living models. And being able to balance the decision making with the accuracy or lack of accuracy in these models has been a real challenge. But it's something that you're trying to talk about the speed here at which this situation has evolved. It literally has gone from a situation where you had essentially no data to something where you now have multiple models out in the industry and people talk about different ways of thinking about this. You can start to Ari's point, you start to have multiple models that you're starting to evaluate simultaneously. So it's been a very rapid evolution. I've seen, in other industries, in the retail industry, for example, the way in which Amazon went about building its infrastructure. There were certainly crises and fire drills you deal with during the holiday season when you're kind of at the peak. This reminded me in many ways of that, but even more so. The fact that time-sensitive nature of the modeling was absolutely critical here.
Yeah, necessity is absolutely the mother of invention. And Amy, when I said that, we did things in 8 weeks that would normally take 8 months or even years, I saw your body language said you agree. Do you agree with that statement? Am I overstating kind of the pace that we were able to deploy and adopt new technology?
You did not. You didn't overstate it at all, BJ. And I think back to what you said initially is that it was a very deliberate decision. And we basically, back to first principles, okay, we're going to have patients who need our help and we're not going to have capacity to help them. So what do we do about it? And we divided it up into 3 big areas, as we have to figure out how to triage patients, just like you would in a war, right? Like, who do you have to help? Where? How? Where do you get people to the right venue of care? And so we set up something called a chatbot that we'd never done before, but it's an automated tool that if you Googled on, do I have COVID or do I have coronavirus? It would take you into this little algorithm that you answer questions and then helps you decide what you need to do next. And then that would automatically send you over to an option to do an Express Care virtual, so a virtual visit online. And we went from having less than 50 a day to, at our peak, doing about 1,500 a day over the course of just a couple of weeks. So we allowed patients to get virtual care at the click of a button. And then figure out who needed to get testing, because as you know, even now we still have limitations in testing. And so we had to pick and choose who got tests, and the people who most likely had the appropriate symptoms, we sent in to get tested through a drive-through test, another big thing we never would have been able to set up, even with our EMR, our electronic medical record. We couldn't set that up, right? And so your team was out there setting up iPad-based drive-through testing centers, in the middle of this pandemic. And then treatment, we had to figure out, how do we treat patients if all the hospital beds are full? And so we set up a way to send patients that we thought were okay but at risk home with things like a pulse oximeter to measure their oxygen levels and a thermometer, and then check in with them on a regular basis at home. So we didn't have to admit every person who we thought was a high-risk patient into the hospital, and instead could care through them virtually at home. And by using all that tech infrastructure, we were able to really care for patients where they wanted to get care, but do it in a way that was very safe. And our outcomes have shown that we did it pretty well. And that was all technology based.
I just want to make a quick plug there. Hopefully it's not self-serving, but normally when you do something so quick, it's bubble gum and baling wire, and maybe it's not a durable solution. The beautiful thing is, I think everything we produce really is durable. When the pandemic is over, the telehealth, infrastructure that we built is going to be durable. The change management of people being careful, of comfortable with doing healthcare from home, sending patients home and being able to monitor them, I think that's going to be durable. So not only did we move quickly, but they're durable assets that change the way we deliver care.
Yeah, can I just pile on that one moment? Is that it shows that the barrier to adoption in the past wasn't the technology, it wasn't the doctors, it wasn't the workflows, it was the reimbursement system. It wasn't in contracts, and patients didn't use it because they thought it would, pay more. And so the fact that barrier disappeared instantly allowed it to scale. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, one other thing to add around a year of work in 8 weeks and sort of progress that's going to be durable is the infrastructure that's been developing around research in our organization. Encountering a novel disease, didn't know how to handle it. There's just a ton that needs to be figured out. And we've had this great group of researchers come together, including clinical trialists and health services researchers who've been studying a huge range of different things about this virus, including what's the best way to treat it. So we've learned a lot about hydroxychloroquine, about remdesivir. We've seen huge changes in clinical practice on the ground. We went from intubating 25% of patients to more like 10 or 11% of patients now, and we've seen improvements in our mortality rate over time inside our hospitals. So we're learning, how to treat. We're learning how to triage. We're learning how to figure out how to do infection control optimally. We're learning, as you've been describing, how best to make sure patients are cared for in the optimal setting. So there's a ton of learning, and much of this is now being done in a scholarly way, which I think is
Yeah, I just want to call out, Ari, I should have mentioned earlier, I was at Microsoft for 25 years, and that's a very specific environment where you don't necessarily collaborate. You don't collaborate with competitors. I really love to see how the World Health Organizations pull together, right? Not only other health systems here in the US, but how we were reaching out to researchers and hospital systems in other countries and really building those best practices. And then all those best practices were being, rolled into the way we treated patients or built our models or ran our systems. And so the way the whole world pulled together on this was truly impressive. And coming from tech, that was something new to me. In tech, we don't do things like that. So it's a great segue, if you don't mind. And Ari, I'll start with you. We talked about these models and how it's helped us during this kind of phase of the crisis. What do you think about the next phase and the potential surge that we're talking about in the fall? Do you think these assets can really help us then, or do you think it's again uncharted waters?
I think we're going to be a lot better prepared for the fall than we were for this time around. I think we've built a lot of valuable and durable infrastructure, as we've talked about. That there will continue to be sort of mysteries that will need to be solved as we go. But just to give you some specific examples, I believe that the surge modeling that Michael and team have been doing is enormously growing in sophistication and is now going from just the question of like, what's the shape of that initial curve going to look like, to helping us figure out what's going on in a hyper-local space, which is, I think, incredibly relevant now as we're seeing some of our communities with considerably more disease activity than others, and finding that we've got to make very specific, calibrated decisions about how to optimally provide care in different communities. Another thing that we've been working on is, for example, predictive modeling. And so we've developed a model that's designed to help with emergency department triage, one of the trickier elements of this. So a patient shows up to the ED with shortness of breath and cough and fever, and you think they've probably got COVID. Are they safe to send home? In many cases, yes, but in some cases, no. How do you know? And so we've used machine learning tools to actually process the data on some 39,000 patients whom we've evaluated for COVID in our emergency departments, on whom we have downstream data about what their outcomes were. And we're in the process now of building an implementable tool that will be available, we hope, in the fall, if we have a surge again for decision making. Speaking of collaboration, we've been collaborating with an AI group at Berkeley and a computer vision group at MIT to see whether it's possible to use a patient's presenting chest x-ray in the emergency department to predict whether or not they're one of the patients who's going to suffer that sudden respiratory deterioration a few days later. So yes, I think there are a lot of tools that we're in the process, that we've built and are in the process of building, that will help us.
And Michael, you mentioned you run a subsidiary here at Providence St. Joseph Health. I assume these assets that we're talking about here are assets that other health systems can leverage.
Absolutely.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that it gets back to some of the points Ari was just making, which is, when we're working in this collaborative environment, we're trying to build solutions that, I view artificial intelligence, for example, it's really part art, part science. It's not a black box that you throw data into and you get a solution out the other end. It's important to really balance the needs with embedding intuitive and kind of insight-driven elements to this. And as Ari and Amy talk about the way in which we're thinking about different types of data, that allows us to start to build solutions that are really driven by insights and by intuition, in addition to the power of AI. So when we start to think outside of a Providence network and potentially bringing these solutions to other end users, that's an important element, because you can start to think about, this isn't just a box that was built based on Providence data. These are solutions that are built off of drivers and important factors that are going to be present outside of Providence and in general networks as well.
Thank you. Amy, do you have anything to add on the modeling and the data and the coming surge?
Yeah, so I think there's the data all about predicting what's coming, but there's also data, and Ari mentioned this a little bit, about the real world data that we're getting from looking at our very large data assets across all of the patients. We roughly touch somewhere around 14 million patients a year. And so that's a lot of information and data we can cull through. And so we can not only do the clinical research on prospective trials, but also look backwards, doing some health services research and figure out whether or not, do non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs actually make a difference in the long-term outcomes or the predictability of patients with COVID, or do ACE inhibitors, a class of blood pressure medications, make a difference? So we can start learning from experience on medications, and the more data we have, the better, because then the more we can actually make credible associations. And so we're spending a lot of time with our data and analytics, not only predicting what's in the future, but using past performance to say, what are the clinical changes that we can do for patients moving forward until we have this vaccine. The other thing we're doing is working with a broad consortium. We have a whole Providence research network to investigate not just the clinical trials with new drugs, but also the basic science and vaccine research. Everything from looking at, does plasma from patients who've recovered make a difference in preventing bad outcomes in people who have the current infection? And if so, what are those specific antibodies? And can we clone and make those in some other way? So there's a lot of work we can do depending on the data that we're generating from treating people who have this germ.
Yeah, excellent point. We always say hindsight is 20/20, and so bringing up that point of being able to play back kind of what February and March and April look like, and cull back through the data, and were there things we missed, correlations that we didn't see, and that can help our patients going forward. And then if there is a surge in the fall, will help us there as well. Amy, earlier you mentioned artificial intelligence and the bot that we use to triage, and we've obviously talked about artificial intelligence and some of the predictive modeling. Are there other artificial intelligence examples you would share with our audience?
We're also doing things, again, in the algorithms that we're using. We're developing for decision support that we have in our electronic medical record. So how can we take two different points in time, which it might make it hard for any one individual to realize that a blood pressure went down an hour ago, and I'm looking at the pulse now, and that's up. But somehow having artificial intelligence or machine learning go back through and pull out these disparate pieces of data and present them to a clinician in real time is a way to make every clinician an expert clinician, because it helps us see things that we miss. And so having that kind of decision support has really been helpful as we get overwhelmed by the amount of data that's coming in. And that's happening not only for patients in the hospital, but for these patients that we're monitoring at home, both the ones that we're doing for COVID, but also now we provide B2B healthcare services in other hospitals through our telehealth program in about 110 different hospitals. And we're using that data in acute care environments as well, doing decision support for people that are off our own footprint. And so having data assets that help us make ever better decisions, help us present information in a way that's digestible for a busy clinician, has made a big difference for us being able to effectively provide care.
Yeah, it's a great example about how do we add value to a clinician, right? So often we ask clinicians to put more into the electronic health record than they get out. And, this advent of Internet of Things and big data, artificial intelligence is really key to cull through that data and show that pertinent data to an overworked caregiver. So an excellent example there. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. Well, the way I keep talking about it with our docs is that the haystack just keeps getting bigger, and it's still got the same number of needles. So how do we find those needles? I'm
going to steal that analogy. That's a good one. Ari, thoughts playing off what Amy said?
Well, one other area that I've been very interested in thinking about the use of AI for has to do with infection prevention. So this is a long-standing interest of mine, and thinking about we're going to be in a situation for a long time, I believe, when we're going to have to care for COVID and non-COVID patients at the same time. And how do we do that? And how do we keep our patients safe? How do we keep our caregivers safe? So one of the things that we've actually started experimenting with is building a graph database to help us understand the network of relationships between patients, caregivers, and other patients. And we're in the process of setting up a very large serological survey, so a test to see which of our caregivers have antibodies. And what I've been thinking about is ways that we can use our data technologies to associate clinicians' interactions with COVID positive patients with risk of clinician acquisition and potentially with risk of hospital spread using that, using those data tools. So we're working on setting that up now.
Yeah, I know Graph was something we used at Microsoft, to really cull through the big data that we had there. Surprised to see that we weren't heavily leveraging it in healthcare. So the example you give is a good one. And I think it'll be really eye-opening how that can show those very complex relationships and potential correlations in this scenario. But I think it's a technology we're going to be able to use in other scenarios as well.
Absolutely agree. I think there's so much potential that's currently untapped in our industry for understanding the relationship between sort of networks and outcomes. A lot of the quality improvement work that we do, the reporting that we do, has to do with tying one doctor to one outcome that a patient experienced, right? Which we all understand doesn't represent reality very well. We care for patients in teams, in the outpatient and in the inpatient setting, right? Imagine that we'd have the ability to look at the relationship between kind of networks of care and the outcomes that our patients experience. And so I'm hoping this is a step in that direction.
Absolutely. Michael, are there artificial intelligence examples you want to share?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the real challenges with these problems is that you have multiple objectives. So you're talking about not only providing the best patient outcomes and patient experience, but also the caregivers. You have limited resources, not only supplies, but also equipment. And then there's obviously financial considerations too. All of these things are elements of a solution. And building a solution for those types of problems in the presence of incredible uncertainty is extremely challenging. So as we think about scheduling and staffing and trying to increase the satisfaction of both patients and care providers, you start to build solutions which have application well beyond the COVID scenario, into more broadly how you think about hospital operational management, whether it be everything from the emergency room through floor units. These are problems which are really challenging problems. And part of this is the fact that there are so many different potential objectives and so much uncertainty, but we're learning a lot through this process. And I think this will have direct implication on our ability to produce viable solutions for larger problems, more broadly speaking, kind of going forward.
Great, thank you. Well, final question, Amy, I'll start with you. This conversation has been pretty technical, but at the end of the day, it's really about serving our communities. We see a lot of disparities in the way healthcare is delivered and the health of our communities. How do you feel like data and artificial intelligence can really serve those inequities and better deliver healthcare to our communities?
It's what gives me hope, actually. It feels like such an enormous conundrum and such an overwhelming problem. The fact that zip code determines health outcomes more impactfully than genetic code, that the socioeconomic status of an individual determines their longevity in life, their capacity to live without comorbidities, without illness. And so we have to do something different for communities that have less health assets in the community. And to know that, we have to be able to see it, right? We need to be able to have the data to say, this area has a high percentage of heart disease and hypertension. And we know that heart disease, hypertension, and people who live in congregate settings, so a lot of apartment buildings and a lot of homeless shelters, for example, are places that COVID can strike. And so that's where we need to put on-site testing. And it might not be drive-through testing if people don't own cars, right? But it might be a van that goes in and actively seeks out locations where we think risk is high. So I think it's a way, actually having data on where do we see the problem, and that's where we can target solutions, is a way for us to start getting at some of these entrenched inequities in care that right now are driving, huge upheaval in our country. And it's time for us to solve that. And data is one of the ways we can do it.
Can I be so bold to say, if we had these capabilities, the data being uploaded to the cloud, the big data, these analytic tools, we may have seen this pandemic growing before they were showing up in our hospitals? I think about, Kirkland and the epidemic we saw there with some of this data. I feel like we would have had earlier insights before patients showed up. You think we can get there, or is that being too optimistic?
I think that's a great question for Ari with syndromic surveillance. And so because it really is, syndromic surveillance is really looking for, and Ari, I am taking words out of your mouth. So you fill them in.
We're both handed off to Ari. Ari, can you answer that question?
There we go.
Yeah, sure. Well, I don't know if we would have been able to pick up what happened in Kirkland early. But I like to think that we're developing technologies that would have given us a shot. So syndromic surveillance, as we were talking about, is using electronic health record data to identify what patients are actually describing as the problems that they're experiencing, and then looking for patterns in communities of those descriptions of what they're experiencing. I do think that that is a useful tool to serve as an early warning for kind of the canary in the coal mine for what's happening in the community. We're also increasingly doing surveillance, like doing actual laboratory testing in congregate care settings that I think will allow us to detect earlier signal as well.
Great. Thanks. Michael, thoughts on how to better serve these communities?
One thing I would add, I think one of the real strengths of artificial intelligence, and it applies here to the syndromic data, is the fact that one of the real challenges we face is it's one thing to kind of look retrospectively, like you said, BJ, and say, could we have seen something happening? Sure, if we had known to look for that information at the time, then perhaps we would have seen it. But artificial intelligence provides us a potential opportunity to have a system identify things that we aren't necessarily looking for. So it's very, would it be something that would work in the future? There's the potential for it, where you could have a system say, we're seeing something unusual in the data. Could you take a closer look at this with experts and determine if it's something that we should explore further? I think it's a promising area, and you bring up a very good point that prevention is challenging in of itself. Prevention, when you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, can be extremely challenging, and this provides at least a potential way of solving some of those problems.
Yeah, naive perspective from a technologist. I guess what I'm thinking of is, a smart thermometer. People are willing to share a lot of data, and if people shared their smart thermometer and were taking their baseline temperature every day, that was going to the cloud. That's part of our big data models. An artificial intelligence bot could look at, kind of the baseline health of a community. On average, there's so many fevers in Kirkland on any given day, and that artificial intelligence could look for changes in that baseline. Why are there more fevers? Why are there less fevers? It isn't necessarily going to call out that there's COVID here, but it would alert physicians to say there's something going on in this community as a variance from the baseline, kind of look here. Is that, I'll throw myself under the bus, is that naive to think, or do we think that's kind of where IoT, these Internet of Things devices can go, and kind of evaluating the health of a population kind of more proactively?
Can I take that one? Yeah, because I think there's a both and there, BJ. I think that would work in communities where people can afford a Bluetooth enabled thermometer. And there's a lot of communities where people can't afford a Bluetooth enabled thermometer. And so back to what Ari and Michael were talking about before, is we have to be really creative with our use of data so that we can make sure we're representing all communities. Because what I worry about right now is, if you look at meat packing plants, there's probably very few people that work there that have Bluetooth enabled thermometers. And so what could we do that would enable us to get data from a meat packing plant? And that might be, sickness claims, days off work, people that called out, so I think we just have to be really thoughtful about what are the data sources we look at, so they're inclusive across the entire spectrum.
No, good point. And, as we start to manage the the health of a population, we may look at those communities and as a health system say it makes more sense to invest in these smart thermometers, give them to communities, give them to those individuals. Obviously, it's a cost to our health system, or it's a cost to the local government or agencies or communities to provide those. But the proactive insight we have, may may give us, 1,000x return down the road if we can, identify these things in advance. But excellent point. We don't want to create, only health for the affluent and not serve these underserved communities. I'm really glad you called out that as being a gap in my theory. Thanks, Amy. Other thoughts before I wrap it up? I think it's been a good conversation. Really proud of the work we've done at Providence St. Joseph Health, the positive impact we've had on our communities. Like I said, the durable assets I think we've been able to build over the last couple of months will really pay off in the future in the way we serve those communities. So I thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a great conversation.
Well, BJ, monitoring this conversation, I'm awestruck by the insights and perspectives as you are all right at that edge of innovation, leading on that edge in the face of what is this unprecedented global pandemic. Who would have thought just a few months ago we'd be sitting here having this discussion, right? And yet I'm so inspired and again, really awestruck by the conversation because it's forward-leaning, it's results-oriented. And you know what, most importantly, what strikes me is that you all are not only looking at it from a healthcare vantage point, you're looking at it from a cross-sector vantage point, which I think is critically important from technology, and looking at it from the perspective that is so critically important to find these solutions. Zip codes, Amy, you zeroed in on the zip code issue that I've talked a lot about over the years. And I feel like, that's cross-sector because you know what, it's healthcare, it's education, it's finance, it's an overlay. You can overlay all of the issues on the zip code issue, which is if you're not fortunate enough to be in the zip code with all of the accoutrements that you need to have all of these situations addressed, then it's an epic fail. So being able to address all of that holistically is important. But Providence St. Joseph Health has been, at this crisis from the very beginning with the very first patient, as you mentioned. And I'd like to, on behalf of Ideagen, applaud your leadership, the changing, personally and professionally, the acceleration of the delivery of healthcare. Thank you for that. Thank you for all you're doing. And thank you for helping to change the world.
Thank you, George. Appreciate you giving us a platform to share our story, and thank you for the partnership.
It's our honor and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.